I'm Professor Shimizu from Kyushu University. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here in Fukuoka. Of course, I'm staying in Fukuoka in Kyushu University. And so I'll be studying firstly ASEAN economic integration and in the world economic change over the long time. And so secondly, I'll be studying East Asian economic integration, including RCEP. And finally, I'll be studying ASEAN economic integration and automobile industry. And so I published many papers and many books about ASEAN economic integration and ASEAN economic communities. You know, this is the latest book about ASEAN economic community. That's AEC. Okay. And so now, I'm the chairman of the ASEAN study group in Tokyo. It's AES-GT in ASEAN Japan Center in Tokyo. AES-GT is a special limited group to study ASEAN issues and ASEAN economic integration from academics, government officials, and corporation representatives. And so we meet every month to discuss ASEAN and ASEAN economic integrations. And this month, we have the ASEAN mission to ASEAN countries, Indonesia, Thailand, and Singapore. And I was the chairman of the mission with the Secretary General of the ASEAN Japan Center, Mr. Fujita. And so we visited ASEAN Secretariat, IRIA, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, ICS, Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, and some ministers, some ministries, universities, and some corporations. Especially in ASEAN Secretariat, we discussed current ASEAN economic integration and AEC with Secretary General and Vice Secretary General and many experts. Anyway, I'd like to discuss ASEAN economic integration in the structural change of the world economy, especially its significance and issues. Okay. And this structure, presentation structure, firstly, introduction, and secondly, the ASEAN economic integration and AEC in the world economy. And the third section is establishment of AEC in 2015. And fourth section is AEC 2025 and looking toward 2025. And lastly, finally, the conclusion. Okay, and the first section is introduction. ASEAN was established in 1967, 51 years ago, and it's Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand. And ASEAN began intra-economic cooperation in 1976. And Brunei joined ASEAN in 1984. And ASEAN agreed on the ASEAN Free Trade Area after, in 1992, CLMV, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam joined ASEAN in the late 1990s, and ASEAN 10. Okay, and so ASEAN agreed on the ASEAN Economic Community, and that's AEC, in 2003. ASEAN moved to economic integration and established AEC in 2015. And so now, ASEAN is moving toward AEC 2025. And ASEAN is the oldest and most advanced economic integration in Asia. Okay, and I'd like to have short introduction, small introduction to ASEAN. And because I think many people in this floor don't know ASEAN so much, okay? And this is ASEAN's and economy. ASEAN economy is the seventh largest in the world and the third largest in Asia. And ASEAN population is the third largest in the world. And ASEAN is increasing the trade rapidly. And so ASEAN and FDI is increasing rapidly, okay? And so its share is about 10% of world inflow FDI. Okay, and this is 50 years of ASEAN. And this is first leaders and signed the Bangkok Declaration in 51 years ago. Okay, and so, okay. And so this is ASEAN, now ASEAN 10 countries. ASEAN is located in between Japan, and China, and India, and Australia, and New Zealand. Yes, and this is ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta. And we visited 2 weeks ago. Many visited. And so these are the ASEAN member states. You know, and Brunei, Dar es Salaam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, and 10 states. ASEAN is comprised of 10 different countries, especially firstly in the populations range. The largest Indonesia, 264 million, and the smallest Brunei, 0.43 million in last year. And so GDP ranges the largest Indonesia, 1.016 trillion US dollar, to smallest Brunei, and 12 billion US dollar. And GDP per capita ranges the largest Singapore, 57,714 US dollar, to smallest Myanmar, and 1,299 US dollar in 2017. But the ASEAN moved to economic integration with these differences. Okay, and so this is trade. ASEAN's trade, it's a blue, increasing, has been increasing. And this is FDI. And ASEAN's FDI has been increasing rapidly. And so this is cumulative FDI inflows into ASEAN and China from Japan. And these are the former is the larger, and from the latter, you know, from Japan to ASEAN is bigger. Okay, and so the ASEAN and automotive production in ASEAN countries has been increased about 4 million cars. And this is the ASEAN's and the automobile sales in ASEAN countries has been increased about 3 million cars. Okay, and so this is very interesting. ASEAN's trade percentage to GDP is bigger than other economies. And this is ASEAN's trade. And so this is ASEAN's GDP. Okay, and so this is very big. And so ASEAN's trade percentage to GDP is bigger than other economies, especially Mercosur, and India, and Japan, and China, and NAFTA, and EU. Okay, and this is very interesting. And so, I'd like to enter the second section, ASEAN economic integration and AEC in the world economy. And this is a summary of the second section. And so 50 years of ASEAN integration and AEC. And ASEAN improved and economic integration in the structural changes of the world economy. And firstly, in the Plaza Code, secondly, the Cold War, the thirdly, Asian economic crisis, and finally, the world financial crisis. And so ASEAN adopted many policies. BBC, brand-to-brand complementation scheme in 1988. And so ICO and the ASEAN Industrial Cooperation Scheme in 1996 and after an AEC. Okay, then ASEAN established AEC in 2015. And so ASEAN established, and especially after ASEAN Free Trade Area, is the free flow of goods and elimination of tariffs. And so about 96% tariff lines are zero. It's a very great success. And so now ASEAN is moved towards free flow of service, investment and skilled labor, and infrastructure building, and narrowing the gap. Okay? And so I'd like to examine some in the second session. 1976 to 2003. ASEAN established in 1967. And so economic cooperation began in 1976. And its policy, I stated the ASEAN's strategy for CISI, collective import substituting industrialization. And so ASEAN adopted an AIP, ASEAN Industrial Project, ASEAN Industrial Cooperation, and Preferential Trade Agreement. And these but then these failed by its many conflicts among the member states. But the ASEAN changed its strategy to the new economic cooperation strategy in 1987. It's due to the changes after the Plaza Accord, Plaza Accord and the Plaza Accord in 1985. And the Plaza Accord changed the exchange rates from high dollar and low yen to low dollar and high yen. After the Plaza Accord, a lot of FDI, especially a lot of Japanese FDI, went to ASEAN countries. Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. It was a big chance for ASEAN countries to develop rapidly. And so ASEAN countries changed its development policy from import substitution policy to FDI-led and export-oriented policies. And just the ASEAN changed its inter-ASEAN cooperation, economic cooperation policy from the old type to new type. ASEAN strategy for CFEI, collective FDI-led and export-oriented and industrialization. Okay, I stated this notion in my first paper, maybe 25 years ago. And so the typical case was the BBC scheme, brand-to-brand complementation scheme in 1988. And this scheme was proposed by MMC. MMC is a Mitsubishi Motor Corporation. It's a Japanese automaker. And so it is fit to this a new strategy. And so ASEAN adopted this and the BBC scheme, and the BBC assisted and many Japanese car maker, Mitsubishi Motor, Toyota, and Nissan. And so I think it was a first good example or ASEAN, intra-ASEAN economic cooperation or economic integration. Okay? And so ASEAN agreed on AFTA, ASEAN Free Trade Area, in 1992. And membership has expanded to Indochina since 1999 due to the changes of the Cold War. Vietnam, Laos, and Myanmar, and Cambodia. And just since the Asian economic crisis, 1997, And so economic integration has been deepening due to changes, and this and the Asian economic crisis. And then and the ASEAN adopted the new concept in the ASEAN Economic Community, AEC. In October 2003, ASEAN adopted the Concord 2 and AEC. AEC's aim is to structure single market and production base by 2020. And so its aim and to invite FDI, foreign direct investments. And so in January 2007, ASEAN front-loaded AEC up to 2015. And in November 2007, AEC blueprint was adopted by ASEAN. Its key pillar were four pillars. A, single market and production base. It includes free flow of first goods, secondary services, third investment, fourthly capital, and finally skilled labor. And this is the center of this and the AEC and AEC blueprint. And so B, competitive and economic region. And the C is equitable economic development. And the last D, integration into the global economy. And so since 2008, ASEAN adopted AEC scorecard and monitoring system. And in October 2010, and ASEAN adopted the master plan on ASEAN connectivity. Okay, and so ASEAN steadily moved to establishment of AEC in 2015. Okay, ASEAN got a good result of ASEAN economic integration. Firstly, it's a tariff reduction through AFTA. And ASEAN steady results obtained thus far through ASEAN economic integration. And the first is tariff reductions. And since 1993 through AFTA. And in January 2010, tariffs were eliminated in 6 original member states. And thus it's realized in the AFTA by 6 original countries. Simultaneously, and tariffs on almost all items were reduced to under 5% in CLMV as well. Okay, and so and the increase in AFTA utilization rate by individual states, it increased. And for example, and 61.3% of exports from Thailand to Indonesia in 2010 used AFTA. Okay, this is a very big figure. Okay, now it increased about 66% in these years. Okay, the second and good result of ASEAN economic integration is support for production networks. Japanese and some other countries and the corporations have been expanding their production networks throughout ASEAN. And ASEAN policies support these production networks. Especially the automotive industry is a typical example. Japanese automotive manufacturers hold a large share in ASEAN, just about 85% currently. And so this is a typical case in Toyota. And Toyota has been supported by ASEAN policies, BBC, ICO, AFTA, and since the 1990s, with major components mutually complemented in the ASEAN region. And so the typical and the good case, the best case is Toyota IMV since 2004. And IMV is an innovative international multi-purpose vehicle. You know, and this is the IMV, and this is the first type IMV, one-ton pickup truck, 2 and 5 types, okay? Single cab and the extra cab and the double cab minivan and SUV. And this is the latest type, okay? And so, okay, yeah. Toyota IMB part procurement, production, and export of one-ton pickup trucks in various areas. And so it turns a multi-layered production network is being expanded to include the primary part makers such as Denso, secondary and tertiary and makers, as well as material suppliers. And so after provides support and this and the division of labor, international division of labor. Okay, and so this is matching of ASEAN integration policy and the corporate production network structuring. I think it is a very good case. Okay, and so this is a thematic main car part and the complementation at Toyota IMB. Okay, and so Thailand plant and producing diesel engines and intensively exporting these to ASEAN, other ASEAN countries. And so Indonesian and the plant is producing the gasoline engine, GE, intensively, and so exporting to other ASEAN countries. And Philippines and the plant and producing the manual transmission, MT, and intensively and exporting these to ASEAN countries. And so Thailand plant and pickup truck and SUVs and mother plant and producing exporting other countries. And Indonesia is the Minimans mother plants. Okay, and so these ASEAN and now exporting pickup truck, SUV, minivan, and diesel engines and gasoline engines, manual transmissions to world markets. Now it is ASEAN planted ASEAN countries exporting car and car parts to the world. And this is a very good and international division of labor and by car maker and the matching of the ASEAN economic integration and policies. Okay, and the third and the result of ASEAN economic integration is ASEAN and led East Asian economic integration. Okay, and the East Asian regional cooperation developed in the wake of the Asian financial crisis. And the key player has been ASEAN. Okay, and the ASEAN plus 3 EAS are deployed in multiple layers. And so ASEAN is the structuring of FTA networks as ASEAN plus 1 FTAs. Okay, CFTA, CEP, AJCEP, AKFTA, AIFTA, ASEAN CER. Okay, these are completed in January 2010. However, FTAs for East Asia as a whole were not established. ASEAN proposed the RCEP in 2011. Okay, this is a framework of East Asia regional cooperation centering on ASEAN. Okay, ASEAN plus 3, RCEP, EAS, PMC, and ARF, and TPP11. Okay, ASEAN is the center of the East Asian regional cooperation. Okay, and this is changes after global financial crisis. ASEAN and East Asia are becoming the most important growth area in the world economy, a major production basis for the world economy, and huge markets for the world economy. So now, on the contrary, in the United States, US, adopted a plan to double export and participated in TPP, aiming to export to East Asia. And so, realization of mega FTAs, TPP, and RCEP. TPP and Japan's participation in TPP accelerated RCEP and CJK FTA negotiations. And TPP and RCEP negotiations accelerated the realization of AEC. Okay. Okay, and in these situations, ASEAN established AEC in 2015. Okay, and this is the first and the pillar, single market and production base. And the first item is a free flow of goods and the elimination of tariffs. And 10 ASEAN member states, 96 tariff lines were at 0%. And this is a very great and a success. Okay, and but the CLMV extended duties with flexibility of 7% of tariff lines up to January this year, 2018. Okay, and so ASEAN improved rules of origin, ROO, ASEAN single windows, ASW, and has been eliminated of non-tariff barriers. And the second is the free flow of service, and free flow of investment, free flow of capital, and free flow of skilled labor in transition. Okay, the B pillar, and the second pillar is competitive economic region, competition policy, intellectual property rights, infrastructure building, and the C, equitable economic development, including narrowing the gap, is very important in ASEAN. Okay, and so the last D, integration into the global economy, RCEP and ASEAN plus 1 FTS. Now, and the next AEC goal is 2025. And ASEAN adopted the AEC blueprint to 2025 in November 2015. And so the last day of 2015 was a great milestone. And so transitional day and a great milestone. Okay, and the next and fourth session, AEC 2025, and looking toward 2025. And this is the new goal of AEC, and the AEC blueprint 2025. Okay, and this is a 5 pillar in the AEC 2025. A, highly integrated and cohesive economy, and this is the center of these pillars. Okay, it includes trading goods, trading services, and the investment environment, financial integration, financial inclusion, and financial stability, facilitating movement of skilled labor and business visitors, enhancing participation in global value chains. And B is a competitive, innovative, and dynamic ASEAN. It's some new in the pillar. And so C is included enhanced connectivity and sectoral cooperation. And D, resilient, inclusive, and people-oriented, and people-centered ASEAN. And finally, E is global ASEAN, including RCEP and ASEAN plus 1 and many FTAs. Now, and this highly integrated economy, infrastructure building, and so narrowing the gap and new objectives for 2025. Oh, okay. Yeah. And so now, and in the extension of AEC in 2015. Okay, and this is a progress of AEC 2025 since 2015. Okay, and the ASEAN adopted AEC 2025 Consolidated Strategic Action Plan, CSAP, in February last year. And so it was updated in August last month. And so ASEAN adopted the master plan, new master plan on ASEAN connectivity and initiative for ASEAN integration. And this year, CLMV removes the extended tariff for 7 of tariff lines. Okay, and so this is the final establishment after. But Vietnam, of course, and removed the car tariff, but Vietnam adopted some non-tariff measures. It's some big problem. Decree 116, of course, I've been studying. And so now, and ASEAN is moved to further economic integration for 2025 in the protectionism of the world economy, especially after the Trump legislation. Okay, and this is the final and the conclusion. ASEAN steadily moved to economic integration and established AEC in 2015. And so ASEAN got the great results of economic integration in AEC. firstly, solid results obtained, tariff reduction and others. Secondly, support for protection networks. Finally, ASEAN has been key player in East Asian economic integration, including RCEP. Okay, not only ASEAN, but also the wider range, wider sphere. Okay, and that's the ASEAN is one of the most important cases of economic integration in the world. ASEAN established AEC in the structural change of the world economy, and ASEAN has been leading the economic integration in the growth center of the world. Okay, ASEAN is some different from and the EU and other economic integration, but ASEAN is one of the most important case of economic integration in the world. Finally, I'd like to state the challenges facing ASEAN economic integration. Okay, firstly, ASEAN must improve and deepen AEC to develop in the world economy. Secondly, ASEAN must maintain the initiative in East Asian economic integration. And finally, ASEAN and Japan must cooperate against the protectionism after the Trump administration in today's world. Okay? Yes, okay, I'd like to wrap up my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the question.